All right, good morning, Emmanuel family. Welcome back to week 3 in our Sunday school series, After God's Own Heart. Last week, we talked about what it means to honor God, not only in the way that we speak, but also in the way that we live our lives with our actions. This week, we're kind of going to talk about something that flows out of our honor for God, and we're going to talk about what it means to honor our parents. And so the backdrop behind me for this week's lesson is actually the house that I grew up in. It's my parents' house. And this was one of the primary places in which I learned, one, to honor God. My parents taught me a lot about what it means to be a believer, about what it means to have a relationship with Christ. But this is also a place where I learned to honor my parents. There were other places, certainly, but this was one of the primary places. That's something that we're going to see today is that one of the best places that we can learn to honor our parents is within our own homes. But as we look at what it means to honor our parents, we see that parents are far from perfect, that we are broken, sinful people that have a tendency to mess up, have a tendency to do the wrong thing, and that our parents are no different. Our parents are broken, sinful people that have a tendency to mess up and to do the wrong thing. And so that means that our parents are not always perfect. But we can still honor them in the ways that we speak and the way that we act. And so the thing that we really need to understand this morning is that God calls children to honor their parents through their lives as a reflection of honor and love for Him. That the way that we honor God should be reflected in the way that we honor our parents. And even further, we are to demonstrate love towards all members of our families, including siblings, extended family, and those that God brings into our families as a result of fostering or adoption or even remarriage. But to get really specific, our relationship with our parents and the way that we honor our parents should be a reflection of our relationship with God and the way that we honor God. I think about me. I grew up as a teacher's kid. I went to the school that my mom teaches at. And when I was going to school, I knew that my mom worked at the school that I was going to school at. And so as I went through my day, I understood that I needed to be on my best behavior because my actions and my words would reflect on my mom, would reflect on her ability to parent me, but also would reflect on her job performance. That, if I'm at school acting a fool, my mom is going to know about that. And she may even get reprimanded for that or thought less of for that. And so I knew when I was at school that I needed to represent her well. Now, that doesn't mean that I always did that. I'm sure my mom can tell you of multiple times where I did not honor her well while I was at school. But one thing that we need to think of, and the reason that I share that with you, is that for those of us who are children of God, we bear His name. And so we are to treat that name with the highest honor in the ways that we live. That just like I knew that I needed to represent my mom well when I was at school, we need to understand that we need to represent God well when we're out in the world, when we're out living our daily lives. And that one of the ways that we can honor God is by honoring our parents, is by honoring our father and mother. And so we see this in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and in 2 Samuel chapter 15. And to give you a little context here, God instructed the Israelites on how they were to live as His covenant people. That's a lot of what the law is about, is God instructing His people how they ought to live, not only in relation to Him, but also in relation to other people. That these laws that God hands down to Moses are meant to instruct the people how to have a good relationship with God, but they're also meant to show people how to have good relationships with one another. And so one of the foundational commands related to how we are to interact with one another, was the importance of honoring our parents. And so when they disobeyed this commandment, the result was heartache and trouble. And that's what we see in 2 Samuel chapter 15, that these consequences were clearly seen in King David's family when his son Absalom rebelled against him. So let's start this morning by looking at Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. It says, "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you." And so one question that we may be asking ourselves right now is, what is honor? What does that really mean? And so the New Testament, in the New Testament, honor means specifically to value highly or to hold in highest regard. And this, by the way, is true in our day too. There may be disagreement regarding the age when children are no longer required to live in obedience to their parents, but children never reach an age when they don't owe their parents honor and respect. One thing that's important to understand here is that, now that I'm married and now that I'm moved out of the house, that doesn't mean that I get to stop honoring my parents. And likewise, my parents, they've been married for a long time. They've been out of the house for a long time. But that doesn't mean that they get to stop honoring their parents. That honoring your parents does not end when you're 18 or when you hit some life milestone. That honoring your parents is a lifelong command and a lifelong commitment. God made it clear that honor and respect are essentials in every home. And God is serious about honoring parents because God understands the whole picture. He knows that it isn't simply about having a happy home or making sure that everybody gets along. He knows that honor is tied to advancing his kingdom here on earth. And so we may be asking ourselves at this point, how can we show honor? And so I would suggest three categories, three ways in which we can show honor to our parents. First of all, we can show honor with our relationships. We honor our parents relationally by spending time with them and through showing genuine concern and love. Some parents to teens love their children dearly, yet their kids are too busy with school and friends and extracurriculars and entertainment, and they rarely ever see each other. I know that was true at a certain stage in my life where, I was in high school, I was doing sports, I was working, and it felt like I never really saw my parents. And so some teens might complain, you don't know how terrible my mom or my dad is. But no matter, they are still your parent. And if for no other reason than that, they deserve honor for that position. And so we don't always have to honor the way that our parents live their lives or the things that they do. But according to God's command, we must honor them as people, as our parents. We see here in Exodus chapter 20 that honoring your father and mother is not a conditional statement. God doesn't say honor your father and mother unless ... God says honor your father and mother so that you may have a long life. The next way that we can honor our parents is to honor them with our words. I grew up in a home where it was natural to say yes, sir, and no, ma'am. And there were certainly times where I didn't agree with my parents, where we didn't see eye to eye on something. And every now and then, there may have been situations where I was right about something and my parents were wrong. But either way, when I addressed my parents, I was taught to do so with respect. And let's be clear, it's not just enough to say yes, sir, and no, ma'am. We must honor our parents in not only the ways that we speak to them, but in the ways that we speak about them to other people. That if you're very respectful when you speak to your parents, but when you get to school, all you do is complain about them, you're not really honoring them with your words. And so third is we can honor our parents with our attitudes. And so it's one thing to obey, right? But it's another thing altogether to obey with a heart that finds joy in doing what our parents ask of us. Scripture teaches that we are to love God with all that we are, and that our obedience flows from that attitude. And so honoring our parents is to be a reflection of this kind of relationship with God. So the next time that your parents ask you to clean your room or to be home by 10 o'clock, remember that obeying while rolling your eyes is not showing honor. And to be honest with you guys, that was the thing that I probably struggled the most with when I was growing up. That, I would say, yes, sir, no, ma'am. We would spend time together, things like that. But for a while during my middle school and high school years, I just had a real attitude problem. And that's something that can be really difficult for us. But we need to understand that not only are we in control of our words and our actions, but we are also in control of our attitudes. And honoring our parents requires that we show respect from the heart. Now, before we move forward, I do want to add a little note to this. I do want to add something before we move on in our discussion, and that is to keep in mind that we are to obey our parents so long as that lines up with obeying the Lord, right? That if your parents or authority figures ask you to do something which is dishonoring to God, or which God would see as wrong, to put it plainly, if your parents are asking you to sin, you have the freedom, and I would even say the obligation, to disobey. That part of honoring our parents may mean that if our parents are living sinful lifestyles and asking us to be a part of their sin, that we can honor God by calling them to a higher standard. And this is difficult. I have somebody that I know from my childhood that their mom had a problem with shoplifting, and she would ask her kids to shoplift with and for her. And this was really difficult for them as kids because they were taught, obey your parents, do what your parents tell you to do, but they knew that shoplifting was wrong. And so for a while they were indulging in that. They were doing that for their mom because they thought that was showing their mom love. Because they loved their mom, they wanted to obey her. But what they eventually had to come to understand was that loving their mom and honoring their mom meant calling her to a higher standard, and meant refusing to obey a sinful command. And so that may be a bigger issue for some of us than others, but I do want to make that clear for us, that our honoring of our parents and our obedience to our parents should always mirror our honoring and our obedience to God. And if those two things don't line up, your priority is to God first, above your parents. And so I have two questions to ask you guys, kind of coming out of this discussion. First, what are some similarities between honoring your parents and honoring God? And second, how can you make sure to honor God, not only with your actions, but also with your heart? So next, let's flip ahead to 2 Samuel chapter 15. We're going to be looking at verses 7 through 12, and I'll read those for us. It says, "When 4 years had passed, Absalom said to the king, 'Please let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow that I made to the Lord. For your servant made a vow when I lived in Geshur of Aram, saying, if the Lord really brings me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron.' 'Go in peace,' the king said to him. So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent agents throughout the tribes of Israel with this message. When you hear the sound of the ram's horn, you are to say, Absalom has become king in Hebron.' 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom. They had been invited and were going innocently, for they did not know the whole situation. And so while he was offering the sacrifices, Absalom sent for David's advisor Ahithophel, the Gilonite, from his city of Gilah. So the conspiracy grew strong, and the people supporting Absalom continued to increase." And so one thing that it's important for us to understand as we kind of talk about Absalom and David is that the life of David's son Absalom serves as an example of how not to live in relation to our parents. Absalom was David's third son, and he was born to David through David's fourth wife, Maacah of Geshur. And this marriage was most likely rooted in the pursuit of political gain and not covenantal love. Maacah was the daughter of Talmai, ruler of Geshur, a small neighboring kingdom to the east of the Sea of Galilee. And so almost all of David's marriages were created for the sake of political gain. And this no doubt created an atmosphere of jealousy and of conflict within the family. And so it's important for us to understand before we move forward that David was neither a perfect husband nor an upstanding father. And so my next question for you guys as we continue to discuss this is, can you list a few ways in which we can honor our parents even when they disappoint us or even when we're upset with them? And so when David sinned against Bathsheba and Uriah back in 2 Samuel chapter 11, he was confronted by Nathan the prophet. Nathan told David a story to highlight his sins. And David himself said the offender should pay back the debt fourfold. We see that in 2 Samuel chapter 12. Sadly, David didn't understand that the story was a parallel of his life, and he had declared his own sentence. And so David would pay fourfold as 4 of his own children would sadly pass away. First, the baby that David conceived with Bathsheba died. Then Absalom killed his brother Amnon. Then Absalom rebelled against his father David and was eventually killed by Joab. And then years later, Adoniah, David's son, sought to take Solomon's throne, and Solomon had him killed. And so David's sin, David's failures as a husband and father had serious consequences in his life and in the life of his family. However, and this is really, really crucial, David's sin did not justify Absalom's behavior. And Absalom was still responsible to honor David as both his father and his king. And so instead, Absalom sought to honor himself at the expense of his father. After returning from his exile for killing Amnon, Absalom sought to take the place of his father as king of Israel. Absalom was popular and well-liked, but with deceptive words and a total lack of integrity, Absalom attempted to win the hearts and the loyalty of the people. And so my next question for you guys is, how does truthfulness and integrity honor our parents? And even coming out of that, how does a failure to be truthful and a failure of integrity dishonor our parents? And so we see in this passage that Absalom dishonored his father with a lie, that he told his father that he was going to Hebron to worship. And indeed, Absalom did go through the motions of worship by offering sacrifices. But Absalom's true intent was to be in a safe place where he could spread the message that he had become king and stage a political uprising and revolt. And so what we see here is that we cannot honor our parents when there's a lack of truthfulness and integrity. Absalom shows us the tragic consequences when we fail to honor our parents, that he brought trouble and death not only to Israel, but even to himself. And so my next question for you guys is, how does your desire to honor your parents impact your decisions? And this can be positive. You can talk about how a high desire to honor your parents can cause you to make good decisions, but maybe it's worth discussing how a lack of honor for your parents may cause you to make poor decisions. But next, let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 13 through 14. It says, "Then an informer came to David and reported, 'The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom.' And David said to all the servants with him in Jerusalem, 'Get up, we have to flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. Leave quickly, or he will overtake us quickly, heap disaster on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword.'" And so Absalom's move to become king appeared to be working. Absalom at this point was winning. Absalom was popular. And one of David's men reported to David that the hearts of the men of Israel were with Absalom and not with David. That had this been an election, David would have been required to step down and let Absalom take office. But, and it's important to understand this here, in their time, in their culture, defeat meant death. And so David rightfully feared for his life in this situation. He knew of Absalom's lack of character, and he knew very clearly that Absalom would not spare him simply because he was his father. He knew that Absalom was only concerned with his own welfare, and that if Absalom got a hold of him, he wouldn't make it out alive. And so Absalom's dishonor of his father David cost him his life in the end. Joab stabbed Absalom with 3 spears while he was stuck hanging from a tree. And those with Joab struck and killed Absalom in 2 Samuel chapter 18. And so though David had sinned in ways that deeply, deeply affected his family, Absalom was still fully responsible for his rebellion. And he ultimately paid the price for that rebellion. And so David, by his own integrity and uprightness, could have encouraged Absalom to honor his father and his king. That David, had he been a good father to Absalom, may have saved Absalom's life, may have prevented all of this. We see that dishonor has a way of recycling itself through our relationships. That we see that dishonor can sometimes pass from generation to generation, that mistreatment and poor parenting are unfortunately sometimes passed on to the next generation. While it's critical for us to display integrity and honesty in all aspects of our lives, there may be times when we still fall into sin. And in those times, we must seek God and His mercy. And so the question remains, what if our parents are people to whom it's difficult to show honor? Some of us are going to have a harder time showing honor to our parents than others because our parents don't make it easy to honor them. If they left us with a legacy of destruction in our own hearts, either through rebellion, bitterness, or other challenges, we must seek to return to the spirit of the Scripture in which God has called us to forgive and to honor them. And I'm going to tell you, that's not always going to be easy. All parents, unfortunately, have made choices that make it difficult for their children to show them honor and respect. We are all fallen human beings, and parents will be inconsistent. They'll be inconsistent with discipline. They'll be inconsistent with the way that they treat their children. They'll show favor to one child over another. They'll speak in anger when they shouldn't, or they'll treat others with disrespect in the presence of their children, or they may even directly treat their children with disrespect. We know that in this world, there's a lot of brokenness, and there's a lot of improper parenting. But no matter parents' strengths or weaknesses, children are to honor their parents. This is what God has called us all to do. And through honoring our fathers and our mothers, we show honor to God. And so one thing that I want to make clear to us is that we have a chance to break the cycle of dishonor. There may be some of us watching this morning that have a harder time honoring our parents because our parents have a hard time honoring us. But I want to encourage us that we as believers have an opportunity to break that cycle. That even when our parents are hard to honor, that we can let our love for God and our honor for God call us to honor our parents. And so the other thing that I want to make clear to us is don't let the sins of your parents give you a license for hatred, resentment, and sin. Your parents may be imperfect, but don't let their imperfection cause you to sin. Absalom didn't have a perfect father. Absalom's father got caught up in sin. But Absalom's issue was that he allowed his father's sin to create resentment, anger, and hatred in his own heart, which eventually led him to sin as well. And so we have an opportunity to break that cycle. So I want to leave you with two questions to discuss. One, who do you know that models the parent-child relationship in a way that honors God? And two, what opportunities do you have to show honor to your parents this week? And so as we close, I want to leave you guys with two things. One, to kids that are watching this video, to students that are watching this video, honor your parents this week. Find ways to do that. And for some of you, it's going to look like finding ways to honor your parents in spite of their sin, in spite of their shortcomings. And that's not going to be easy. But I would encourage you to find ways to honor your parents this week. And maybe for some of you, you need to learn to forgive your parents this week. You need to understand that your parents are imperfect, but they are in need of forgiveness, and that you have an opportunity to break the cycle of dishonor. But second, to parents that are watching this video, I want to encourage you to be parents worthy of the honor that God is calling your children to give to you. Understand that you have a high calling as a parent, that God calls your children to honor you. And so one, make sure that obeying you is a reflection of their obedience to God. Don't ask them to do things that God wouldn't ask them to do. And second, make it easy for your kids to honor you this week. Make it easy for your kids to honor God in the way that they honor you. But as we close, know that I'm praying for you, that I'm thinking of you, and that I'm here for you. And if you need anything this week, feel free to reach out, and I'll see you next week.